The desert night had a sound of its own, an endless hush, broken only by the wind whispering through brittle sagebrush and the far-off cry of a lone coyote. The moon hung low, silver and cold, casting pale light over the ruins of an old trader's cabin half buried in sand. Inside, beneath a torn patch of canvas roof, Alara sat shivering beside a half-dead fire. Her dress, once pale blue, was now streaked with dust and blood. Her breath came uneven, her heart still thundering from the escape. She'd been running for hours, maybe days. She could no longer tell. The desert had no mercy, and neither did the men chasing her. Somewhere behind her lay a broken wagon, a burned settlement, and a man who'd sworn to make her his wife whether she wanted it or not. When she reached the cabin, she collapsed inside, too weak to go further, praying only that the night would hide her. Now, as she sat with her knees drawn to her chest, she stared at the fire's dying glow. The crackle of wood was the only thing reminding her she was still alive. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound outside felt like a footstep. She whispered a prayer she half remembered from childhood and clutched the silver cross around her neck. Then came the sound that froze her blood, a low, steady rhythm of hoofbeats, growing louder, closer. She rose quickly, stumbling toward the back wall. Through a crack in the boards, she saw a horse, dark and tall, snorting in the moonlight. Its rider dismounted without a word. She couldn't see his face, only the glint of metal, a bow, and a braid that hung over his shoulder. The door creaked open. For a long, terrifying moment, no one moved. The stranger stepped inside, his frame filling the doorway. He was an Apache. She knew by the beads on his chest strap, by the quiet power in his stance. His gaze swept the room, sharp as a blade, then landed on her. Alara's breath hitched. She pressed herself against the wall, trembling. "Please," she whispered, "I don't mean harm." The man said nothing. He shut the door behind him, slow and deliberate, and the wind's howl was cut off. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then he moved toward the fire, crouched, and struck flint against stone. Sparks leapt, light spreading across his face, a face carved with years of hardship. High cheekbones, sun-browned skin, eyes as dark as storm clouds. A long scar ran from his temple to his jaw. He looked like someone who'd seen war and lost everything in it. She expected anger. Instead, there was calm. "You're bleeding," he said at last. His voice low and rough from disuse. Alara blinked, realizing for the first time that her arm was indeed cut. Blood had dried across her sleeve. When he reached for his water pouch, she flinched back. He paused, watching her carefully, then placed the pouch and a cloth on the floor between them and stepped away, giving her space. Something in that simple act, his restraint, his distance, made her throat tighten. She knelt, cleaned her wound clumsily, then whispered, "Thank you." He gave no answer, only fed the fire until the cabin was warm again. The orange light flickered across his face, across the faint shimmer of his turquoise necklace. When he finally spoke, it was like the desert itself had found a voice. "This place isn't safe," he murmured. "You should not be alone here." "I have nowhere else," she replied softly. Their eyes met, hers wide with fear and exhaustion, his unreadable yet strangely gentle. The fire popped between them like a heartbeat. In that fragile silence, something unspoken passed, an understanding that both had fled something cruel, that both had come here not by choice but by survival. Outside, the wind howled against the walls. Inside, two strangers shared a fragile fire, each caught between the ghosts of their past and the uncertainty of the night ahead. And as the flame flickered and the shadows danced across the walls, Alara realized something strange and terrifying. For the first time since her escape, she no longer wanted to run. The wind howled outside, dragging dust and sand against the wooden walls like ghostly fingernails. Inside the dim cabin, the fire Caton had built burned steadily now, its orange glow softening the sharp edges of the night. Alara sat wrapped in a rough wool blanket she'd found in a corner, but even its warmth couldn't quiet the pounding of her heart. The Apache man, Caton, as she would later learn, moved with the silent assurance of someone born in wild places. He stripped off his riding gloves, set down a water skin, and began unwrapping a bundle from his saddlebag. She watched his hands, the way they worked, not rushed, not nervous. He wasn't like the men she'd known before. Those men barked orders and took what they wanted. This one didn't speak at all. When he turned back toward her, she instinctively drew back, clutching the blanket tighter. His gaze didn't linger on her face like a predator's might. Instead, it went to her injured arm. "Let me," he said simply. His voice was low, roughened by desert air, but calm. Alara shook her head at first. She didn't trust strangers, and Apache men in the stories she'd been told as a child were the monsters hiding beyond the tree line. But she wasn't a child anymore, and something in his eyes was steady enough to keep her from bolting. He knelt on one knee, holding the clean cloth toward her like an offering. "Won't hurt," he added quietly. Her breath trembled as she extended her arm. His fingers brushed her skin, and the shock of warmth nearly made her flinch again. She expected harshness. Instead, his touch was careful, almost reverent. He poured cool water from the skin, washing away the dried blood. It ran down her wrist, staining the dirt floor. He cleaned the wound slowly, methodically, as if he'd done this many times before. "You were running," he said, not as a question but a fact. Alara looked down, unable to hold his gaze. "Yes, from who?" She hesitated. Her throat burned. "A man," she whispered finally. "One I was supposed to marry. One I never wanted." For the briefest moment, Ketan's jaw tightened. He didn't pry, but his silence said more than words could. He wrapped the wound with a strip of linen torn from his own shirt. His movements were practiced, not rushed, not careless. "You should rest," he said softly, sitting back on his heels. Alara stared at the fire. "I can't. If I close my eyes, I'll hear their horses again. You're safe tonight." She almost laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "No one's safe. Not out here." Ketan didn't argue. He walked to the door, checked the latch, then returned to sit a few feet away from her, his back against the wall. He stared into the fire with the stillness of someone used to long silences. She studied him in the flickering light. His braided hair, the faint tattoos on his arm, the scar along his jaw. She realized with a jolt that he couldn't be much older than her, but his eyes, they belonged to a man who'd seen too much. The fire cast their shadows across the wall, 2 figures alone against the wild night. Her pulse slowed a little. She drew the blanket tighter, listening to the storm batter the cabin. "What's your name?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her. "Ketan." "Alara," she offered back, the name catching in her throat as if it barely belonged to her anymore. He gave a small nod. "You bleed. You fear, you run, but you live." The way he said it, not as pity but as respect, made something stir in her chest. No one had ever said words like that to her. She looked down at the linen around her arm. "Thank you." Ketan didn't smile, but something softened in his face. "Fire keeps the dark away," he said simply. "Sleep while it burns." But Alara didn't sleep. She watched him instead. The way the light touched the angles of his face, the way his shoulders tensed whenever the wind grew louder, as if he was always ready to protect or fight. She wondered what ghosts haunted him, what pain carved those scars into him. Somewhere outside, a branch snapped, sharp against the night. Alara flinched. Ketan's hand went to the knife at his belt without hesitation, his eyes narrowing. For a tense moment, the world held its breath. Then silence returned, heavy and endless. He didn't relax again until long after the sound faded, and Alara, clutching her blanket, realized something terrifying and strangely comforting. If the world came crashing down around them tonight, he would be the last one standing. The fire popped again, a soft reminder of warmth in a cold world, and for the first time in many nights she wasn't alone. By morning the desert had quieted, but the silence was not peace. It was the heavy, listening kind that seemed to wait for something to break. The storm had passed, leaving a pale light filtering through the cracks in the roof. Dust hung in the air, soft and golden. Alara stirred from a half-sleep, her head resting against the wall, the blanket still wrapped tightly around her shoulders. For a moment she forgot where she was. Then the smell of smoke, leather, and horse reminded her. She turned her head and saw Ketan sitting by the open doorway, sharpening a blade with slow, rhythmic strokes. He looked carved from the same stone as the desert itself, solid, silent, and marked by time. His hair caught the light, his eyes unreadable as he glanced toward her. "You sleep lightly," he said. "I've learned to," she replied, rubbing her eyes. He sheathed the blade, rose, and offered her a small piece of dried meat. She hesitated, then took it. It was tougher than leather, but hunger made her grateful. She ate in silence while he adjusted the saddle on his horse outside, scanning the horizon. "Are you going to leave?" she asked softly when he returned. He didn't answer right away. "If soldiers come, they'll find this place," he said instead. "You should move before sundown." Something in her chest sank. She didn't know why she wanted him to stay, only that his presence, his quiet steadiness, made her feel less like a hunted animal. "You could come with me," she said, the words escaping before she thought them through. Caton turned his gaze on her, sharp but not cruel. "You don't know me." "Maybe not," she admitted. "But I know you didn't hurt me when you could have. That's more than I can say for most men." For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed his face, something between pain and surprise. He walked to the fire pit, stirred the ashes, and said nothing. Alara watched the play of shadow and light on his skin, her curiosity gnawing at her. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked finally. He didn't move, didn't look at her. "Because everyone I lived for is gone." The words hit her like a gust of cold wind. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, unsure what to say. When he did look at her, his eyes were far away, staring not at her but into something buried deep in memory. "My people were camped near the San Pedro River," he began quietly. "When I was a boy, we hunted, traded, sang. The soldiers came one morning, said we'd broken their peace. They came with rifles and torches." His voice tightened. "I ran into the river when the shooting started. When I came back, there was nothing left but smoke." Alara's hand went to her mouth. She had heard stories like that before, whispered by travelers, denied by soldiers. But hearing it from him made it real. He continued, his tone flat but trembling beneath the surface. "I buried my mother with my own hands. My father, I never found him. I left before the white men returned to count the dead." For a long time the cabin was silent except for the whisper of the wind. Alara felt something crack open inside her, an ache that had no name. She had run from a cruel world, but this man had survived one far worse. "I'm sorry," she whispered. The words felt small, useless. Caton shook his head. "Don't be sorry. The dead don't need sorrow. They need remembering." He stood, shoulders straight, but his hands clenched at his sides. The scar that ran from his temple to his jaw caught the light again, and she suddenly understood. It wasn't just a wound. It was a story, carved into him by the world that had taken everything. Alara rose slowly, stepping closer. "And what about you?" she asked softly. "Who remembers you?" He looked at her, and for the first time she saw not just pain, but exhaustion, the kind that lives deep in the soul. "No one should," he said. "I've done things to survive that good men shouldn't speak of." She reached out before she could stop herself, her hand brushing his forearm. He didn't pull away, but his muscles tensed under her touch. "You're still here," she said quietly. "That means something." Caton met her gaze, the firelight reflecting in his eyes like embers refusing to die. For a heartbeat they stood there, two broken pieces of different worlds, finding a fragile recognition in each other's silence. Then he stepped back, turning toward the door. "Rest while you can," he said. "Night comes fast in the desert." But when he walked outside, Alara followed him with her eyes, her heart heavy. She didn't yet know that his past would soon become part of hers, that his ghosts were not done haunting the living. And as the desert sun rose higher, painting the world in golden dust, she realized that Caton was not just a stranger who'd saved her. He was the beginning of something she couldn't yet name, and something that would change them both forever. The day passed in slow silence. The heat outside grew thick, pressing against the cabin walls like an invisible weight. Alara and Caton spoke little, but every glance, every movement carried its own language. He repaired a crack in the wall while she swept the dust and gathered fallen branches for the fire. Neither admitted it, but the rhythm of simple work steadied them both, like two people pretending for a few hours that the world beyond the door no longer existed. By the time the sun dipped behind the jagged red hills, the desert had cooled to a pale blue hush. Caton built the fire high, its light pushing back the long shadows. The flicker cast across his face, illuminating the strong line of his jaw, the scar, the quiet weight of a man who carried too many memories. Alara sat on the floor opposite him, her knees drawn close, her face soft in the firelight. She had washed her hands and brushed the dirt from her hair, but her eyes, those wide, searching eyes, still carried the restless look of someone not used to being still. Caton broke the silence first. "You said you ran from a man," she hesitated. "Yes, your husband?" Her throat tightened. He wanted to be. My father promised me to him. He's rich, owns land near Tucson, but he's cruel. Everyone knows it. He treats people like they belong to him. When I told my father I'd rather die than marry him, she trailed off, her fingers twisting the edge of her blanket. He said I was being foolish. He said I'd learn to obey. Caton's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened. So you ran. I waited until night, she whispered. Stole a horse and just rode. I didn't even know where I was going. I only knew I couldn't let him touch me. The fire snapped loudly, as if the desert itself responded. Caton's gaze softened, the edges of his stoicism cracking for the first time. The world you come from, he said quietly. It calls us savages. But I've seen what your men do to their own women. She met his eyes, something fierce sparking in her chest. Then you know why I couldn't stay. He nodded once, his gaze dropping to the fire. For a while they just sat, listening to the pop and hiss of the flames. Outside, coyotes called to each other under the moon. When Alara finally spoke again, her voice was a whisper, barely a sound. Caton. He looked up. She swallowed hard, her cheeks flushed in the warm glow. I don't want to go back to that life. I don't want to live afraid anymore. You won't, he said softly. But I'm still afraid, she admitted. Afraid of tomorrow, of being alone, of never feeling safe. Her voice broke on the last word. Caton's jaw tightened. He turned his gaze back to the fire, his thoughts unreadable. Safety is not something the desert gives easily, he said. You have to make it for yourself. Or find it in someone who won't take it away. Her eyes shimmered. And what if I already found that person? The air between them shifted. Suddenly fragile. Suddenly alive. The firelight flickered across her face, across the curve of her throat, the trembling of her lips. Caton's voice came rougher than before, edged with restraint. You don't know what you're saying. I do. Her whisper was barely more than breath, but it carried every bit of longing she'd been holding back. Her hands trembled as she set the blanket aside and crawled closer to the fire, closer to him. All my life, she said, I've been told what to do, what to feel. I'm tired of living like something to be owned. She lifted her eyes to his. I don't want to be a virgin tonight, Caton. I want to feel alive. The room went utterly still. The fire crackled, throwing shadows that danced across the cabin walls. Caton didn't move for a long time, his face unreadable, his eyes locked on hers. Then slowly, he rose to his feet and crossed to the door. The sound of the wooden latch sliding into place echoed in the silence like a heartbeat. When he turned back, there was a storm in his eyes, desire, yes, but also sorrow, fear, and something deeper that looked like reverence. He stepped close enough that she could feel the heat of him, but he didn't touch her. Alara, he said quietly, you don't understand what you ask. She met his gaze, unflinching. Then teach me. For a long breath, neither moved. Outside, the wind swept over the sand, carrying the sound of the night. Inside, two souls stood on the edge of something sacred and dangerous, a place where pain and healing met, where the past could be burned clean in the firelight. Caton's hand hovered near her cheek, trembling slightly before he drew it back as though fighting himself. If I touch you, he said, his voice raw, it won't be because of want. It will be because I've forgotten what it feels like to be human. Alara's lips parted, her eyes glistening. Then remember. And in that fragile moment, surrounded by desert silence and flickering light, something in him broke, the years of distance, the walls of grief, and he let himself feel for the first time in a long, long while. The sound of the wooden bar sliding into place echoed through the small cabin, heavy and final. Outside, the wind picked up again, carrying the smell of rain and mesquite. Inside, the fire snapped and flared, painting the walls with restless light. Caton stood with his back to the door, his hand still on the latch. The moment seemed to stretch forever, neither of them speaking, both unsure what the next breath would bring. Alara's heart thudded so loudly she thought he must hear it. The glow caught on his eyes, turning them into deep pools of amber. He didn't move closer, not yet. There was a battle in him. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, in the tension of a man who wanted to reach forward but feared what that touch might mean. I shouldn't have come here, he said quietly, as if to himself. Not into this room. Not this close. She rose from where she sat by the fire. Her bare feet brushed the cool dirt floor. You didn't come, she said softly. I asked you. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and his breath caught. The fear, the exhaustion, the pain she'd carried since the night she fled had melted into something steadier, calmer. She wasn't begging. She was choosing. "I've been taken, ordered, caged," she whispered. "But this moment is mine." Katan closed his eyes as if those words alone could undo him. When he opened them again, the fight had drained from his face, replaced by quiet surrender. He crossed the room slowly, every step deliberate, until he stood before her. The distance between them was a breath. He reached up, fingers trembling, and brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. The gesture was cautious, reverent. The firelight revealed the faint sheen of tears in her eyes, and in his. "You don't know what you give," he murmured. "I give what I choose," she said. Her words seemed to steady him. His hand fell to her shoulder, strong and warm. The closeness between them hummed like a live current, not born of desire, but of something deeper, a need to be seen, to be touched without fear. When she leaned against him, it wasn't the rush of passion she felt first. It was safety. The solid weight of his chest, the heartbeat beneath her ear, the roughness of his breath. Real, human grounding. He rested his chin lightly against her hair, and for the first time in years his body stopped bracing for battle. "You should rest," he whispered. "I will," she said. "But don't leave." "I won't." They sat together beside the fire, the storm pressing around them. Ilara closed her eyes, letting the sound of rain replace the noise of fear that had lived in her for so long. Katan kept one arm around her, his other hand gripping the edge of the blanket as if holding the world together with that small act. Outside, thunder rolled over the hills. Inside, the light dimmed, soft and steady. No promises were made. No words were needed. The locked door was not a prison. It was a fragile boundary against the cruelty of the world beyond. Inside it, two wounded souls allowed themselves, if only for one night, to breathe without running, to exist without masks. And when the wind finally died, the cabin fell into a peace neither had known before. The dawn crept in quietly, as if afraid to disturb what had happened in the night. Faint light slipped through the cracks in the cabin's walls, painting thin lines across the dirt floor and the sleeping form beside the fire. Ilara stirred first. The embers glowed low, their warmth fading but still alive. For a moment she didn't move. She just lay still, listening to the quiet rhythm of Katan's breathing. He was sitting against the wall, his head bowed slightly, eyes closed but not fully asleep. He looked peaceful, or perhaps just tired in a way that went beyond the body. She sat up slowly, drawing the blanket tighter around her shoulders. The air was cool, the world still. A strange calm filled her chest, but it was not without its ache. The memory of the night before hovered near, soft, fragile, like smoke. Katan opened his eyes then, as if he had sensed her movement. He didn't speak right away. His gaze found hers, steady and unreadable, and for a moment neither knew what to say. "Did you sleep?" she asked softly. "Some," he murmured. His voice was hoarse, deeper in the morning quiet. "You?" she nodded. "A little." He looked away toward the fire. "Good." That single word hung in the air like a stone dropped into still water. It wasn't cold or distant, but careful, as though he was trying to find the line between comfort and caution. Ilara's hands fidgeted in her lap. She wanted to thank him for the safety of the night, for the way his presence had quieted the storm inside her, but the words tangled in her throat. When she finally spoke, they came out almost in a whisper. "I didn't mean to make things strange." He turned his head toward her, one eyebrow slightly raised. "You didn't," she hesitated. "Then why do you look like you're ready to ride away?" Katan exhaled slowly, the muscles in his jaw tightening. "Because staying might hurt you more than leaving." Ilara frowned, rising to her knees. "You think what happened last night was wrong?" He shook his head. "Not wrong." He met her eyes again, his gaze heavy but honest. "But dangerous. For both of us." She waited for him to explain, but his silence said more than words could. She understood. He came from a world that did not forgive crossing lines, a world where men like him were hunted simply for existing. "Katan," she said quietly, "I don't care what the world thinks." "That's because you've still got a world to return to," he replied. "I don't." His tone wasn't cruel, it was sorrow, wrapped in resignation. He stood stretching his shoulders as the early light hit his scar. It made him look almost unreal, a man carved from sunlight and loss. Alara rose too, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. You saved me, she said. You gave me something no one else ever did, choice. Don't take that away now. Ketan's eyes softened. I'm not taking it. I'm just reminding you that choice has a price. For a moment she thought he might reach for her again. His hand even twitched slightly as if remembering how it felt to touch her. But then he let it fall. He crossed to his saddlebag instead and began to pack his few belongings with quiet precision. Ilara's chest tightened. You're really leaving? He didn't look back. The soldiers who burned my people still ride these trails. If they find me here, they'll find you too. I won't bring that danger to you. Her voice trembled. So that's it? He stopped, finally turning to face her. The faintest trace of emotion flickered in his expression, a mixture of regret and something deeper, something like longing. It doesn't have to be the end, he said. But if I stay, it will be. The morning light spilled brighter now, catching on the fire's smoke, on her tears, on the sadness neither of them knew how to name. Ketan stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat of him again. He reached out, brushed his thumb lightly across her cheek, a touch that lingered, trembling between goodbye and promise. Be strong, Alara, he said softly. The desert only spares those who learn to stand. She caught his hand before he could pull away, holding it tight. You're wrong, she whispered. Sometimes the desert spares the ones who learn to love. His breath hitched. For a heartbeat it seemed he might stay. Then he gently freed his hand, his eyes holding hers one last time. Outside, his horse snorted, sensing its rider's decision. Ketan turned toward the light, shoulders squared, heart heavy. Alara watched him walk into the brightness of the new day, her fingers pressed to the place on her cheek where his touch still lingered. And though he left without another word, she knew this was not the last time their paths would cross. The distance between them trembled, not as an ending but as the beginning of something that refused to die. Days passed like dust through the wind. Alara wandered the small cabin as if it still held his shadow. She tried to busy her hands, tending the small garden, gathering herbs, patching the torn fabric of her only dress, but her mind refused to settle. Every night she looked toward the horizon, wondering if Ketan still rode beneath the same stars, if he still thought of her when the wind grew quiet. The memory of his touch lived in her skin like heat that wouldn't fade. It was maddening, the way his absence filled the air louder than his presence ever had. Then, one evening, the quiet broke. It began with the low, distant rumble of hooves. At first, Alara thought it was thunder rolling in from the mountains. But as the sound grew sharper, she realized it was men, riders, many of them. Her heart clenched. She stepped to the window. Dust plumes rose in the distance, glinting with the dull shine of rifles. Soldiers, the same kind who had burned Ketan's camp. Panic clawed at her chest. They were coming straight for the valley. Before she could move, a hand clamped over her mouth. She gasped, but then froze as a familiar scent of smoke and sage filled her lungs. Quiet, a low voice whispered against her ear. Ketan. Her pulse jumped. He pulled her gently back from the window, his body solid and warm behind hers. When he removed his hand, she turned to face him, eyes wide, heart wild. You came back, she breathed. His expression was hard, his jaw tense. They tracked me this far, he said. I thought they lost the trail, but... He glanced toward the window. They're searching every cabin and shack they find. They'll reach this one by nightfall. Alara's mind raced. We can hide... He shook his head. Not for long. If they find you helping me, they'll kill you too. Then we'll run, she said quickly. There's a ridge east of here if we cut through the dry riverbed. Ketan caught her wrist. Alara, listen to me. His voice softened, but the look in his eyes was that same fierce calm she remembered from the night of the fire. Running with me means you never come back, ever, no home, no safety. Just the wild and what we can carry. She stared at him, the weight of his words sinking in. You think I care about a roof when the man I love is hunted like an animal? Something flickered in his eyes, pain, disbelief, longing. You shouldn't say that, but I do, she whispered fiercely. You think what I feel for you is something I can just forget? Ketan's control wavered. His breath deepened. You don't know what it means to love a man like me. I know exactly what it means, she said, stepping closer until her palms rested against his chest. It means not letting fear make the choices. For a heartbeat, the tension between them was a storm. Tight, trembling, alive. Then with a low groan, Caton gave in. His hands found her waist, pulling her against him. Outside, the wind carried the faint sound of shouted orders. Inside, the air burned. He kissed her like a man starved for more than touch, for redemption, for peace, for something human in a world that refused him that right. Their kiss deepened, slow and fierce, a promise made in defiance of everything waiting beyond those walls. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers. "We leave before the moon rises," he murmured. "We'll ride through the canyon. If we make it past the ridge, we can lose them in the desert." Ilara nodded, her fingers trembling as they gripped his shirt. "I'm not afraid." He smiled faintly, a flash of warmth through the hardness. "You should be," he said, "but I'll take that fear from you." They moved quickly then, packing dried food, water, Caton's rifle, her few belongings. The cabin that had once felt like safety now felt like a trap. As the last light faded, Caton saddled his horse. The desert sky burned orange and purple, and the air smelled of danger and dust. Ilara turned once, looking at the little home she'd built, the herbs drying by the window, the worn chair by the fire, the life she was leaving behind. Then she felt Caton's hand slide into hers. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. "Only if you don't let go." He looked at her for a long, silent moment, his thumb brushing the back of her hand. "I won't," he said simply. They mounted the horse together, her arms wrapping around his waist. The soldiers' torches flickered in the far distance like fireflies of death. Caton nudged the horse into motion, and together they rode into the vast, shadowed wilderness, two souls against the world. The night glowing with slow fire behind them, the desert swallowed them whole. Caton's horse galloped beneath the rising moon, its hooves pounding against the dry earth, sending echoes bouncing off the canyon walls. Behind them, the faint glimmer of torches wove through the darkness like snakes of fire. The soldiers were close, too close. Ilara clung to Caton's back, her fingers gripping his shirt, her heart racing with fear and something fiercer, resolve. The wind tore through her hair and sand bit against her cheeks. Yet through the chaos, one thought burned steady. She would not lose him again. Caton pulled hard on the reins, guiding the horse into a narrow pass between towering rocks. Shadows swallowed them, the moonlight barely reaching the canyon floor. "This way," he said, his voice low but certain. "There's an old riverbed ahead. If we reach it before dawn, they'll lose our tracks." Ilara nodded against his shoulder. "And if we don't?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. They rode until the horse trembled beneath them, breath coming in ragged bursts. Finally, Caton slowed, sliding off to lead it by the reins. The canyon had grown colder now, its walls tight and echoing with the ghostly sounds of the night. Ilara dismounted, her legs weak but steady. "How much farther?" "Far enough," Caton murmured. "But we'll need to rest before sunrise." They found shelter beneath a natural arch of stone, where the canyon narrowed to a whisper. Caton built a small fire, shielding it with rocks to hide the light. The flames cast long, shifting shadows over his face, shadows that seemed to echo the weight of the past he carried. Ilara watched him in silence for a while. The exhaustion in his shoulders, the quiet precision in every movement. It was clear he'd been running long before she met him. Finally, she spoke. "You've done this before." He looked up from the fire, brow furrowed. "Done what?" "Run," she said softly. "Hide! Survive!" Caton's jaw tightened and he poked the fire with a stick. "It's all I've ever done." There was a pause. The wind whistled through the canyon, whispering secrets older than either of them. Ilara's eyes softened. "You told me once that the soldiers burned your people. You never said why." He didn't look at her at first. His gaze stayed on the flames. "Because I fought back," he said finally. His voice was calm, but his eyes were not. "They came to take our land, promised peace, then broke every word. I led a raid to drive them out. We killed men, too many, and they came back with fire." Ilara swallowed, her throat tight. "You were defending your home." He gave a faint, humorless laugh. "They didn't care about the reason. To them, I'm just another savage with blood on his hands." She stepped closer, kneeling beside him. "You did what anyone with a heart would have done." He looked up at her then, his eyes fierce and unguarded. "And what about now? You've seen what following me cost. You still think I deserve saving?" Ilara didn't flinch. She reached out, touching the side of his face. "You don't have to deserve it," she whispered. You just have to want it. For a long moment, Caton didn't move. The firelight flickered between them, painting warmth over their scars. Then slowly he leaned forward until their foreheads touched. I don't know how to stop running, he admitted quietly. Then don't, she murmured. Just let me run with you. Something broke in him then. Not the hard, stoic warrior she'd first met, but the man buried beneath. His hand came up to cradle the back of her neck. Gentle despite the strength in it, they stayed like that, wrapped in silence and firelight, until the first faint glimmer of dawn touched the canyon walls. Caton stood. His expression sharp again, but softened by something new. Hope. Fragile but real. They'll reach the ridge soon, he said. We ride east into the Badlands. Few dare to follow there. Ilara gathered her things, glancing once more at the dying fire. Why not? He met her gaze. Because that place doesn't forgive weakness, she smiled faintly. Then it's the perfect place for us. Caton's lips curved just slightly and he extended his hand to her. Stay close to me, he said. I always do. They mounted the horse once more, the morning wind rising like a promise behind them. As they rode deeper into the canyon, the sun broke over the rocks, washing the desert gold. The soldiers were still searching somewhere far behind. But for the first time, Ilara didn't feel hunted. She felt alive. Together, they disappeared into the light, two shadows against the endless horizon, bound by fire, blood, and a love that refused to fade. The desert was merciless. By the third day, the sun had burned away all sense of time. Morning, noon, and dusk blurred into one endless stretch of heat and silence. The air shimmered with mirages, phantoms of water that disappeared the moment they approached. Caton and Ilara rode without speaking for hours, conserving strength. The horse's flanks were streaked with foam, and its breathing grew shallow. At last Caton pulled the reins and guided it beneath a jagged outcrop of stone, offering what little shade the canyon provided. Ilara slid down first, her legs trembling. Her lips were cracked, her throat raw. There has to be water somewhere, she murmured. Caton nodded grimly. There is, but not near. He knelt by the dust, pressing his hand to the ground as if he could feel the heartbeat of the land itself. Then he looked up at her, eyes steady despite the exhaustion. Rest, I'll go ahead and scout. She shook her head. Not alone. Ilara, no. Her tone was sharp enough to stop him. If you go, I go. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, weary but genuine. You're stubborn. I learned from you. He sighed but didn't argue further. Together they walked deeper into the canyon, leading the horse by its reins. The silence between them was heavy but not empty. An unspoken trust bound every breath. Then as the sun dipped toward the horizon, Caton stopped suddenly. He crouched low, studying a faint line carved into the sand, a trail barely visible. What is it? Ilara whispered. Not soldiers, he murmured. Apache markings. A signal for safe ground, her heart leapt. Then we're close to your people? Caton's eyes darkened. If any survived. They followed the faint trail until twilight deepened. The air cooled, and shadows lengthened like fingers across the sand. Then faintly they heard it, the trickle of water. They broke into a run. Around a bend, hidden by rock and scrub, lay a small spring, clear, shining, alive. Ilara fell to her knees and drank greedily, tears mixing with the water. Caton let her drink first, then filled his canteen and offered some to the horse. When he finally sat beside her, the stars were already blooming overhead, cold and brilliant. The silence between them felt softer now, eased by the sound of water. Ilara turned to him, her face illuminated by starlight. Caton, when you said you fought back, when you lost your people, did you ever swear vengeance? He stared into the spring, seeing memories reflected instead of his own face. I swore I'd never love again, he said quietly. Love made me hesitate. It made me weak. She touched his hand gently. Then why did you come back for me? Caton's breath caught. For a long moment he said nothing. Then in a voice that trembled like wind through leaves, he answered, Because my oath was already broken the moment you said my name. Her chest tightened. Then make a new one, she whispered. Right here, tonight. He met her eyes, the fire of the stars flickering in his pupils. And what would that oath be? She leaned closer, her hand pressing against his heart, that no matter how far we run, you'll never walk alone again. The desert around them seemed to hold its breath. Keitan's hand rose to cover hers. "And you?" he asked softly. "I swear," she said, voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "I'll stand with you, even when the world calls it madness." He closed his eyes for a moment, then leaned forward until his forehead rested against hers. "Then let it be the desert's oath," he murmured. "Our promise under open sky." They stayed like that for a long while, the night wrapping around them like a vow. No words, no fire, just the rhythm of their breathing and the pulse of something ancient binding them. Then Keitan lifted his head, scanning the horizon. "We can't stay long," he said. "If the markings are here, others might be too." "Friend or enemy," Alara nodded. "Then where do we go next?" "South," he said. "Toward the Painted Mesa. My people once took refuge there. If anyone still lives, they'll be waiting." She glanced at him, eyes gleaming in the starlight. "And if no one does?" He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. "Then we build something new." The desert wind rose, carrying their words into the endless dark. Together they stood hand in hand beneath a sky vast enough to swallow everything: fear, loss, and even love. Keitan glanced once more at the stars, then whispered something in his native tongue. Soft, reverent. Alara didn't ask what it meant. She only reached for him, their fingers interlacing in silent agreement. That night, the desert bore witness to a new kind of promise, not of war or vengeance, but of two hearts refusing to be erased. The journey south stretched over 5 brutal days. The desert tested every step they took, its silence, its heat, its unrelenting vastness. Each sunrise came with new challenges: sandstorms that blinded, cold nights that cut deep, and the haunting fear that soldiers might still be following somewhere behind the horizon. But side by side, Keitan and Alara endured. When she stumbled, he lifted her. When he faltered, she urged him on. The desert became both enemy and witness, burning away everything false until only truth remained between them. By the 6th evening, the world around them began to change. The sand flattened into wide plains and the horizon bled with color, red cliffs streaked with gold and copper. "The Painted Mesa," Keitan murmured, his voice hushed with memory. Alara followed his gaze. The cliffs glowed like living fire under the setting sun. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It was our last stronghold," he said. "A place of stories and ghosts." They approached slowly, climbing a winding path that led to a hidden plateau. As they reached the top, the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint trace of smoke. Keitan froze. "Alara, stay behind me." He moved forward cautiously, one hand on his rifle. The smoke came from a small fire tucked beneath an overhang. Beside it sat 3 figures, 2 men and a woman wrapped in worn Apache garments. Keitan's breath caught. One of the men rose, stepping into the light. His hair was streaked with gray, but his eyes, dark, sharp, and unyielding, recognized Keitan instantly. "Keitan of the Ende," the man said in their tongue. "I thought you were dead." Keitan bowed his head slightly. "So did I." The older man's expression softened, then shifted to guarded curiosity as his gaze fell on Alara. "And who is this woman you bring to our sacred ground?" Alara straightened under his scrutiny. Before she could speak, Keitan answered, "She is the one who saved me from forgetting who I am." The man studied them both for a long, heavy silence. Then he nodded once. "Then both of you will share our fire." They joined the small circle. The woman offered food, roots and roasted grain. Alara accepted it gratefully, though her heart pounded. She understood that in this place, every gesture meant something deeper than it seemed. As they ate, the older man, called Tahan, Keitan's uncle, spoke quietly of what remained. "The soldiers came again last winter," he said. "Those who didn't flee were taken or killed. We hide now, small as dust scattered to the wind." Keitan's jaw tightened. "Then we fight again." Tahan shook his head. "No, fighting brought us here. The land needs time to heal, and so do we." His eyes met Keitan's. "You carry a burden of vengeance, but it's time to let it fall." Keitan stared into the fire, torn between duty and exhaustion. "And if peace costs us our pride?" he asked. Tahan's voice was calm but firm. "Peace isn't surrender, nephew. It's survival." Alara listened silently. She could feel Keitan's struggle beside her, his whole life built on loss and rage now colliding with the quiet possibility of rest. After a long pause, she placed her hand gently on his arm. Maybe your uncle is right, she said softly. Maybe the fight now is to keep something alive, not destroy it. Ketan's gaze met hers, and for the first time the firelight reflected something like release in his eyes. He nodded slowly. Then we stay. Here. Together. Tahan smiled faintly, as if seeing the ghost of Ketan's father in him. Then the mesa welcomes you. That night, Ketan and Alara climbed to the highest ridge overlooking the vast desert. Below them, the world stretched endlessly, dark dunes glowing beneath the moon, wind whispering through the canyons. Alara leaned into him, her head against his shoulder. Do you ever think about what might have happened if we'd never met? Ketan's arm tightened around her. No, he said quietly, because the world I'd see without you in it isn't one worth remembering. The last light of the setting sun flared behind them, washing the mesa in crimson and gold, the color of endings and beginnings. Ketan turned to her, his voice low but sure. This is where it ends, Alara. The running, the fear. Here we make our home. She smiled, tears catching the glow of dusk. Then let the desert be our witness. He kissed her, slow, reverent. Like sealing a vow the wind would carry forever. And when the sun finally vanished, the stars rose over painted mesa, bright and endless, as if the sky itself had blessed their oath. Two souls once hunted, now found peace among the stones in silence, no longer fugitives but part of the land's eternal story.